It's laughable to think that that would have been cutting edge for the time, but it must have been mind-blowing in arcades back in the day. Anyway, so first up on our little Sega Saturn retrospective is, of course, Virtua Fighter. This game was released in, what was it? 1993, and is often cited as the first 3D fighting game. And when it came out, it definitely turned heads in arcade with its, groundbreaking graphics as well as its surprisingly deep gameplay as well. So when it was announced that Sega was bringing the game to their new Sega Saturn, people of course got excited, and it would end up becoming one of the console's first major hits. According to Sega, they had a 1-to-1 sales ratio for the game in Japan, which is something I believe because of all the Saturn games that I attempted to purchase before I got it modified, Virtua Fighter was definitely one of the cheaper options. And even though they had to make some concessions in order to get the game on the Sega Saturn, it is still for the most part a decent port. So the story of Virtua Fighter is actually very basic. It's just another international fighting tournament a la Street Fighter. But, what fighting game doesn't know at least something to Street Fighter? I guess the thing that we should talk about are, of course, the graphics, which I feel like most people today would just straight up say don't hold up anymore. I don't know, there's definitely a charm to how the graphics look in Virtua Fighter. Like, just the polygonal character models and how they're attempting to use motion capture in order to bring them to life. There is still something to it. You gotta admire the ingenuity for the time. Though, I definitely wouldn't call it realistic. And I feel like Sega was aware of the fact that these graphics were going to age out pretty quickly, because on the arcade cabinets, they didn't try to make the characters look like real people. They actually tried to make them look like they were in the game. So I think they were trying to sell it more as a style than anything, which was a smart move. The music in the game is fantastic, though. It's got some great sound effects as well. As far as the gameplay goes in Virtua Fighter, though, it's definitely not my favorite fighting game. So the whole idea with Virtua Fighter was that they wanted to create a very accessible fighting game, and they thought that the issue was the fact that fighting games were too complex for casual players. So instead of the traditional 4 or 6 button combination that you typically see for fighting games like Street Fighter, they instead opted for a 2-button system, or 3-button system. You have a punch, a kick, and a block button. Now, on paper, that's a lot easier to wrap your head around as opposed to the 6-button system, but I would actually argue that it makes the game more complex. So, with the 6-button system, 6 buttons, 6 attacks. So right there you have pretty good repertoire of moves to play the game with. But as you play the game, you realize that you'll get more attacks if you happen to be pushing on the joystick in a certain direction while you're pressing the buttons. So that, in essence, quadruples the amount of moves that you have. Then you start realizing you can get special attacks by doing specific inputs on the joystick in conjunction with button presses. And after that, you start getting into the more advanced stuff. So it's sort of designed in a sense that you can naturally learn how to play the game. But if you're just picking it up for the first time, there is still some depth that you can squeeze out of it without having much knowledge of it. You just have to memorize what buttons do what, which isn't that bad. With Virtua Fighter, with the 3-button system, you only have 2 attacks. And then, not only that, but pushing forward on the joystick, or in this case a D-pad, doesn't necessarily change your attack aside from making it high or low. So you essentially have to go into the special input straight away, which usually requires some kind of cockamamie button combination that is also really hard to input too. It's definitely not the smoothest of fighters out there, which is a shame because I do like the concept behind the approach to fighting in Virtua Fighter. The whole idea is that rather than the anime exaggerated style of Street Fighter, the combat in this game is supposed to be more grounded in reality. Though, as you can see, there are definitely some ridiculous moves in there, but the idea is that flurry of punches can be countered with a well-placed kick to the face. So it's definitely a button masher's worst nightmare. But with the whole idea of different disciplines being matched against each other, I just feel like Street Fighter does it better because, the anime exaggerated depictions of the fighting styles just works better for this type of game, I feel. Though, that's not to say that Virtua Fighter is bad by any stretch of the imaginations, it's just that I prefer Street Fighter in general. As for the Sega Saturn port, though it was touted as 1-to-1 when it first came out, it definitely wasn't, and people realized that very quickly. The character models weren't as crisp, and you can see in the background there, the edges of the stages that you're on actually render in as you approach them. So it definitely wasn't arcade perfect, but, it still played like Street Fighter, so not Street Fighter, Virtua Fighter. So if that's what you want to play on the Saturn, it's still a perfectly competent version. It would later be followed up by a second iteration of the game, Virtua Fighter Remix, which added texture mapping to the character models in order to bring them up to the standards of something like Tekken or Soul Blade. It would then be followed by Virtua Fighter 2, which was an improvement on all fronts, and is still one of the more fondly remembered games in the series. It would of course be followed by Virtua Fighter 4 and 5, but the most recent game in the series, which I think was in 2006 or 7, was Virtua Fighter 5 on the PS3. And this is probably Virtua Fighter at its absolute best. But since this game came out, there hasn't been any real activity in the Virtua Fighter series. And not even when Capcom brought back fighting games with Street Fighter, Sega hasn't attempted to put any new games out, which is a little out there. But hey, Sega's digging into their back catalog at the moment for new games. Crazy Taxi is due out soon. I think a Golden Axe is going to be in the works as well. So who knows, if those games do well, maybe Virtua Fighter will get another shot, which I would like to see. I feel like there's a lot you could do with this game on modern consoles. But anyway, that's Virtua Fighter, guys. Be sure to join me tomorrow as we tackle our second game.